Hello everybody, hope you are well and enjoying your summer. Hong Kong summer is, well, I'm looking out of the window. It's what you would expect. It's either far too hot, far too humid, or it's raining. And as someone who is not a massively outdoor person, you can probably given that I'm normally surrounded by tech gadgets and doing things that are indoors, summer isn't really my season. I'm much more of an autumn winter person. But that is irrelevant to what I'm talking about today. Now, the last video, you may recall, I was talking about the introduction of an anti-doxing law in Hong Kong that is still going through the various machinations as we speak, and it may come into force. Obviously, will have an impact if it does on technology companies in Hong Kong or indeed around the world. What I'm going to talk about today is another law which already is in force in China, but also may come to Hong Kong and then cause similar issues, maybe not just for technology companies, but for organizations in general who have to deal with the US and with China. This is the Chinese Anti-Sanctions Law. Now, this is already in force in China. It came to force back in June, I believe, the 10th of June 2021 from memory, but there is talk of it coming into force in Hong Kong as well. So it will either be brought into law the same way as they did the National Security Law, by essentially inserting it into an annex, or it may even be passed in Legico. Who knows? That is irrelevant. What is relevant is the effect it will have on companies, tech companies dealing with Hong Kong or dealing with the US. US companies based in Hong Kong would have a similar challenge too, as they do already in China. But what is the anti-sanctions law? Before I can answer that, I have to tell you what a sanction is. Now, I assume you know. Do you remember Donald Trump? Floofy hair, floofier than mine, often had a bit of an orange tan, was a like him or loathe him president. That's a very diplomatic way to put it, I have to say. One of the weapons he used against China, and certainly against Chinese individuals and against Chinese companies, was to issue a sanction, essentially making sure that US companies could not deal with that individual or deal with that organization without facing its own penalty or a fine. Now, I've done technology-related legal work where you have issues where if you are trading with a country or an organization who is subject to a sanction, you can face a massive fine, or worse, you can get into all sorts of trouble. So it essentially prevents someone from dealing with someone else. That's probably the best way to describe a sanction. And Hong Kong sanctions, actually Hong Kong and China, sanctions are pretty widespread as a response to what's been happening in Hong Kong over the last few months, as a response to what's been happening in Xinjiang. A lot of states, a lot of jurisdictions, the US probably being number one, has issued sanctions against individuals or indeed against technology companies. Technology companies is a good example of who've been the targets for places like Xinjiang. Now, China's clearly had enough. It has had an impact. Huawei has had a terrible time as a result of US sanctions, and we have individuals even here in Hong Kong who say their life has been made more difficult, because if you have a sanction and someone can't deal with you without essentially breaching that sanction, imagine having to open a bank account or having a bank account when actually you can't have a bank account without facing some sort of penalty in the US. It's a problem, right? Nobody's going to give you a bank account, otherwise they can't use the US dollar. Our chief executive here went on record to say because she can't easily open a bank account or use a credit card, our house is full of piles of cash, which was an interesting statement to make. It's hard to feel sorry for someone who says that, but I can see how it would be a massive, massive issue. Imagine buying stuff on the internet. It would be very difficult. So China has to come up with a way to solve this, and this is their anti-sanctions law. Now, this allows their creation of an anti-sanctions list. This is a list of organizations or individuals who are subject to the anti-sanctions law and may face penalties. Now, if you're on the anti-sanctions, basically, think of it this way. If you are abiding by US sanctions, so suppose you're dealing with company A, Chinese company, they suddenly find themselves sanctioned by the US. You are this company here. If you then abide by that sanction, refuse to deal with them, or indeed are involved in, even an individual who's anyway involved in actually bringing that sanction into effect, or in its implementation, you can then find yourself on the anti-sanctions list. That means that you can face penalties in China and presumably then in Hong Kong. So these penalties, in case you wonder what they are, the first one is you can be denied entry to China or deportation. I presume the same will be in terms of Hong Kong. You can have your assets frozen in the jurisdiction in Hong Kong, China, Hong Kong when it assuming it comes into force. You can have a prohibition against doing business with any Chinese entity or Chinese business. So that means you literally can't trade with a Chinese business. That's a massive thing considering the sort of global world we're supposed to live in. And the last penalty is any other necessary measure. That could be anything. That could be anything from, I suppose you could be locked up, you could have your own sanctions levied against you. Anything could happen, essentially. It's such a wide term, as many Chinese laws often have them in there, and they just interpret it as they see fit. So this means if you are essentially a company abiding by a US sanction, you face effectively a sanction for abiding by the sanction. So sanction 1 from the US, sanction 2 from China, bang. You have the rock, you have the hard place, you're the technology company, in the middle, essentially. How do people deal with this? Now, one of the reactions has been, well, it will only affect large banks or large tech companies. You can see it applying to some of the tech giants if they essentially refuse to deal with China and then essentially get hit by the anti-sanction sanction. Doesn't really trip off the tongue, but there we go. Banks is the obvious one, and there's been various talk about them leaving Hong Kong, which again I don't think will happen. I think there's a lot of people freak out about what's going on, but it is an issue. Now, the people who can find themselves on the anti-sanction list as the individual responsible or the organisation, it can be the spouse or family member of someone who is essentially complying with a sanction. It can be any organisation's management or the controller that can then fight them. So the management of say a large bank or a large tech company can find themselves on the anti-sanction list and then subject to penalty. Any other organisation that is linked to whoever is complying with the sanction, and indeed, I guess the list is endless. Now, this is clearly a weapon. It's clearly China's way of saying, look, we're sick of people, of the US in particular, using sanctions as a tool to try and complain about what we're doing on the international stage. Certainly we may see even sanctions brought in over the doxing law, which again, you're going to get sanctions, you get anti-sanctions, but it just creates this terrible environment. I'm not saying either side is right or wrong, but how can we essentially have a global technology environment? How can we have a global business environment when you've got people throwing sanctions back and forth and you've got this incredible uncertainty as to whether it's safe to do business with an entity, not do business with an entity? You could even get to a position where you're first to trade with someone and they're on a sanctions list, and you may not have even decided not to trade with them because of that, but they may say, well, because you're on the anti-sanctions list, we're going after you. Don't forget, because under this new Chinese law, the Chinese entity can sue you for abiding by an existing sanction. It is all an unholy mess. It's not helped by the fact that the law itself is incredibly vague, as many of these things are, but I think we're entering into, we've already had a tech war that's been going on for ages, a trade war that's still going on. You could argue we've got a bit of a cold war. It's just going to make life very difficult. In practical terms, as happened with the Huawei sanctions, it will stifle innovation, so we have the problem there. In good terms, perhaps it'll stop companies doing bad things, but I don't think it will. I think all that's going to happen is people will throw sanctions across each other, the rock and hard place analogy stays, and people are just essentially now, could mudslinging be sanction slinging? Yeah, people are essentially sanction slinging. Now, this law will take effect, it already is in effect in China, it's going to be brought into law in Hong Kong. It will have an impact anywhere in the world. It's extra jurisdictional, so it doesn't matter where you are. If you're complying with a sanction that affects a Chinese interest, you are in breach of the anti-sanctions law. You can find yourself on the anti-sanctions list. It's just making everything more and more complicated. I was hoping not to be doing a video over the summer, but I thought this was such a big thing that I should talk about it. Let me know what you think. Will other jurisdictions follow suit? I would imagine that they probably will. You will find that the world is slinging sanctions and anti-sanctions back and forth, and nobody really knows who they can deal with. Will it make China and Hong Kong less of an international place to do business, or is the converse true? Will it make the rest of the world, will it make the West a place where people don't want to do business, or are we going to end up, this is something that I've always thought was going to happen, the more that technology sanctions were coming into force around the world, in the same way we have a very different internet in one part of the world to the rest of the world, and we're going to find this is going to be the same of our business environment, of our tech environment, of everything. Because think of what a terrible, terrible waste that would be. Who knows? Anyway, thank you for listening. I'll be back very soon. Have a good rest of the summer and hope it's a bit brighter than the one here in Hong Kong. Take care.